I sent over $1.5 million to my online boyfriend that promised me marriage at 84. The hardest part of the day is the light, not the morning light that's thin and forgiving, painting the eastern walls of this cavern in pale gold, but the afternoon light, the relentless horizontal light of 4 o'clock. It doesn't illuminate. It exposes its lance through the west-facing windows of the drawing room, a blade of dust-speckled gold that cuts across the Persian rug Arthur bought in '78. It finds every mote, every forgotten fiber. It shows the slight fade on the arm of the Chippendale sofa where I've sat, read, and waited for 30 years. It shows the ghost shape on the wall where the larger Turner watercolor used to hang before the children insisted I sell it for security. Security, as if a bank balance could pad the silence. This is my museum, Willow. Creek Lane, 23 rooms of accumulated evidence. Evidence of a life lived correctly, expensively, and with a profound, screaming quiet. I am its sole curator now. Arthur, my head curator for 55 years, departed his post 5 years ago. A quiet exit befitting the man. A failure of the heart in his sleep. The doctors said it was peaceful. I believe them. Arthur excelled at peace, at quiet, at the gentle, relentless maintenance of stasis. I walk the halls. My footsteps on the heart pine floors are the only conversation. They echo just slightly a soft, hollow tap-tap that follows me from the foyer past the formal dining room we used 6 times a year. Into the sunroom where the ferns have outlived both the dog and any real sense of joy. I know every board that creaks. The one by the library door sighs like a bored old man. The one near the grandfather clock, a monstrous, ticking thing Arthur's father brought from England, groans a low D-flat. It's a symphony of decay, and I am its lone conductor. I stop before the portrait in the hallway, painted when I was 42, Eleanor Pembroke. Wortham. The artist caught the sheen of the emerald silk, the gloss of my chestnut hair, the cool confidence in my eyes. He could not capture the slight pressure of Arthur's hand on my shoulder as I sat for it, a proprietary weight, a brand. I was his then, his wife, his hostess, his beautiful, compliant object. I look at her, that woman of paint and trapped light, and I feel nothing but a distant pity. She had no idea of the 30 empty years stretching before her. She still believed in the narrative. Maria, the cook, is here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She leaves meals in the sub-zero refrigerator, each in a glass container with a neat label. Chicken soup, wed lunch, beef stew, fry dinner. They are delicious, nutritious, and utterly without love. They are fuel for the machine of my body, which persists with a stubborn, unasked for. Loyalty. Sophia, the cleaner, comes on Mondays. She moves like a ghost with a feathered duster, restoring order, banishing the evidence of my solitary week, a single teacup, a book left splayed on a sofa, the indent of my body on a chair. She erases me every 7 days. The children, David and Caroline, call every Sunday. It is a scheduled event like a presidential address. David talks about market volatility and his son's lacrosse team. Caroline talks about her foundation's latest gala and her daughter's orthodontia. They ask, "How are you, Mother?" And before I can draw breath to fashion a truth, they continue, "That's good. We're so busy. They love me, I believe this, but I am a landmark on their map, a fixed and familiar point they can glance at to orient themselves before speeding on. They do not see the museum. They see the fortress. They assume its walls still protect treasure. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I leave my bedroom, the bedroom, still vast and dominated by the bed Arthur and I shared for half a century, and I wander. I run my fingers over the spines of first editions no one reads. I trace the cool marble of the fireplace mantel. I stand in the center of the ballroom-sized living room and feel the sheer, overwhelming volume of space around me. It is filled with things. Baccarat crystal, Ming vases, a concert-grade Steinway I haven't touched in a decade. It is utterly empty. This is the paradox of my wealth. It built me a palace of absence. It purchased the finest silences. It gave me a life where every practical want was met so completely that the one wild, impractical want, the want for a hand that seeks, a voice that whispers, a gaze that hungers, became a monstrous, unspeakable indulgence, a flaw in my character, ingratitude. The afternoon light is fading now, softening from a blade to a blush. Soon it will be gone, and the museum will be lit by discreet, recessed bulbs, a uniform, shadowless light that shows nothing and hides nothing. I make my way to the kitchen to pour a glass of water from the tap that cost more than some people's cars. I will heat one of Maria's containers. I will eat at the vast island on a stool with a book propped open that I will not truly read. I will listen to the hum of the refrigerator and the slow, mortal tick of the clock. This is my life at 84. I am the curator of the silent museum. I know every exhibit, every crack in the marble, every whisper of the past. I am waiting, though I do not know for what. Not for death precisely. That seems too passive. Perhaps I am waiting for a final, unexpected patron to walk through the door. Someone who will look past the collected artifacts, past the faded portrait on the wall, and see the woman standing in the dust-mowed light, and see that she is, against all odds and reason, still here. The great unspoken narration by Eleanor, it began not with a bang, but with a gentle, mutual retreat. A diplomatic withdrawal from a territory that had become for him impossible to hold. I was 58, Arthur was 63. We were in Bermuda at the same pinks and resort we'd visited for 20 years. The ritual was comforting, the same suite, the same waiter who remembered my preference for Earl Grey, the same afternoon naps. With the sound of the surf, that evening, after a dinner of grilled snapper and a bottle of exquisite Chablis, we returned to our room. The moon was a perfect wafer over the ocean, laying a path of silver on the water. In the old days, in the real old days, such a sight would have been a prelude. It would have led to my dress puddled on the terracotta tiles, his hands firm on my sun-warmed skin, a shared, wordless conspiracy against the ordered world outside. I stood at the balcony doors, the salt air on my face, feeling the wine and the moonlight stir something old and warm in my blood. I turned. Arthur was already in his pajamas, crisp blue cotton, sitting on the edge of the bed, methodically brushing his hair. His ritual, 50 strokes with a silver-backed brush. It's breathtaking out, I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. He looked up, smiled his kind, tired smile. It is. Don't stay up too late, Ellie. The sun will be strong tomorrow. He finished his brushing, set the brush precisely on the nightstand, and slid under the covers on his side of the bed. That was the night I knew, not suspected, knew. The distance between us was no longer the respectful foot of a long married couple. It was a continent. The great unspoken had officially been founded, and we were its first and only citizens. There was no event, no medical pronouncement. It was a slow dimming, a power outage in a once vibrant city. At first, there were apologies. Murmured in the dark, his back to me. I'm sorry, my dear, just terribly tired. I would pat his shoulder. Of course, Arthur. Get some rest. The pats became our new language, a language of consolation, of benign pity. Then the apologies stopped. They weren't needed. The new borders were established. Intimacy became a series of small, civilized kindnesses. He would pour my tea. I would lay out his pills. We would discuss the stock portfolio, the children's. Careers, the merits of reciting the house. We were excellent business partners, exemplary companions. But my body did not get the memo. It was a traitor. It hummed with a persistent low-grade current of want. It noticed the strength in the gardener's forearms as he pruned the roses. It thrilled at the accidental brush of a waiter's hand at a charity dinner. It felt like a separate, shameful entity I carried around inside my good twin set. And pearls. I would lie beside Arthur's sleeping form, listening to his steady, untroubled breaths, and feel a screaming in my veins. It wasn't just the act, it was the attention, the focused, consuming attention of another person who sees you not as a function, a wife, a mother, a hostess, but as a landscape to be explored. I was starving for a gaze that held heat. I considered, of course, in the secret chambers of my mind, I played out scenarios. A discreet affair with Charles, the gallerist who always held my hand a beat too long. A passionate, ridiculous fling on a solo trip to Italy. But I was Eleanor Pembroke. My name was on hospital wings and library plaques. My life was a transparent, spotless crystal vase. To introduce a crack, to pour that messy, dark water of desire into it. It was unthinkable. The scandal wouldn't just be mine. It would be the children's, the grandchildren's, a stain on the narrative we had all worked so hard to maintain. I was the curator even then. I could not vandalize my own exhibit. So I curated my hunger. I pressed it between the pages of forbidden novels I kept in a drawer. I translated it into a fanatical dedication to my yoga practice, bending and stretching a body that craved a different kind of unfolding. I sublimated it into furious gardening, digging my hands into the earth as if I could plant the need and be rid of it. Arthur knew. He was not a fool. He saw the extra hour I spent at the gym, the new intensity in my eyes when I played Chopin on the piano pieces filled with a yearning he could no longer answer. He would watch me sometimes, a faint, helpless sorrow in his eyes. It was the sorrow of a man who has lost the key to a room he still wishes to enter. He loved me in his way, a way that had become placid, paternal, and utterly sexless. Our bed became a vast, icy tundra. We inhabited our respective poles. The silence between us at night was different from the comfortable daytime quiet. It was a thick, alive silence, pulsing with everything we could not say. It screamed of his inadequacy and my desperation. It was the loudest thing in our world. We never spoke of it, not once. That was the most elegant and brutal part of our pact. To give it voice would be to admit its reality, to shatter the beautiful, fragile lie of our perfect life. So we tended the lie. We hosted dinner parties where we were the picture of genteel unity. We held hands at family weddings. We smiled for photographs, our shoulders touching, a perfect study in marital bliss. But in the museum of our marriage, the central exhibit, the master bedroom, had been permanently closed, roped off with velvet cords of silence. The patrons could admire the exterior, the public facades, but the heart of the place was dark and still and cold, and I, the keeper of it all, wandered its perimeter every night, a ghost, longing for a fire that could never be lit again. The prescribed life a narration by Eleanor. After the borders were set, life became a matter of elegant administration. I did not have a marriage. I had a portfolio to manage. Arthur was its largest, most stable asset, reliable, predictable, paying steady, if emotionally meager, dividends. My own vitality became a volatile, risky stock I had too short constantly. My days developed a rigid, medicinal rhythm, a prescription for sanity, or perhaps a numbing agent. Mondays were for the body. I would be at the club by 8:30 a.m., not the noisy, family-oriented club, but the old stone-columned athletic club downtown, where the only sounds were the muffled thump of tennis balls, the click of mahjong tiles, and the low murmur of old money discussing things it no longer needed to shout about. I worked with a personal trainer, a relentlessly cheerful young man named Todd who called me Mrs. P, and urged me to feel the burn. I did. I sought it. I wanted to burn away the restless energy, to exhaust the body that kept whispering its traitorous needs. I would push until my muscles trembled, a clean, physical ache overriding the murky, emotional one. Tuesdays and Thursdays were for the arts. The symphony board, the museum acquisition committee, the friends of the library. We sat in high-ceilinged rooms, women of a certain age and means, deciding the cultural fate of the city. We debated the merit of a contemporary glass installation versus restoring a Baroque fountain. We planned galas with intricate seating charts, where the placement of a CEO's wife was a geopolitical event. I was good at it. I had an eye for aesthetics and a mind for logistics. It was a chess game, and it consumed a great deal of mental RAM, leaving little processing power for self-pity. Wednesdays were for grooming, a meticulous 3-hour procession, hair at Jean Pierre's where the gossip was as stiffly lacquered as the coiffures, a massage, the long clinical strokes of Ulrich, who asked no questions, a manicure. It was maintenance. I was preserving a monument, the polish on my nails, the subtle highlights in my hair, the expensive creams applied to my face. They were not about beauty, not really. They were about upkeep, about holding the line against the entropy that was, I felt, already complete within. Fridays were often charity luncheons, large pastel-filled rooms at hotels, plates of poached salmon and asparagus, and speeches about diseases we were all quietly terrified of getting. We wrote checks with many zeros, trading money for a sense of purpose, for our names on programs, Eleanor and Arthur Pembroke, always together. A united brand. I would smile, make polite conversation, and feel a dizzying dissociation. I was playing the role of Eleanor Pembroke so completely that I sometimes wondered if the wanting, aching woman underneath had simply evaporated. Perhaps she had been successfully curated out of existence. Evenings were the quietest part of the prescription. Arthur and I would dine, often in the formal dining room under the cold gaze of a Waterford chandelier. We discussed the day's events, the market close, a committee decision, news from the children. Our conversation was a neat transcript, devoid of subtext. We were reading bullet points to each other. After dinner, we would retire to the library. He would read biographies of dead presidents. I would attempt novels, but the passionate entanglements of fictional characters felt like a cruel joke, a spotlight on the empty stage of my own life. I'd usually end up reading architectural digests, studying floor plans of homes I would never live in. The hunger did not die. It was simply displaced. It went into the fury with which I deadheaded roses, beheading blooms with a sharp, satisfying snip. It went into the intensity of my opinions on abstract expressionism. It leaked out in the way I sometimes drove my car too fast on the winding roads outside the city, the windows down. Classical music blaring, a fleeting, unsustainable sense of freedom. Society was my warden, but also my shield. What would people say? Was not just a fear. It was the entire architecture of my life. To shatter it would be to make myself incomprehensible. I would become a scandal, a punchline, a poor thing. Loneliness within the fortress was preferable to exile. At least here in my prescribed life, I had a title, a role, a script. To step outside would be to become a woman with no lines, standing alone in a blinding, silent spotlight. So I took my medicine, the medicine of routine, of obligation, of curated beauty and managed solitude. I told myself it was enough, that this was what maturity looked like, the graceful, genteel setting aside of childish things. but sometimes in a quiet moment between appointments, standing in my perfect walk-in closet surrounded by silent, beautiful clothes, I would catch my own reflection in the full-length mirror. I'd see the elegant woman impeccably dressed, and a question would rise, unbidden and terrifying. Is this all? Has the final official portrait already been painted, and I am just waiting for the paint to dry? A Bittersweet Freedom and Narration by Eleanor. His death was a soft thing, like a page turning in a book you've long since stopped enjoying but felt obliged to finish. There was no drama, no final bedside confession. One evening he finished his chapter of Eisenhower, marked his page with his silver bookmark, a gift from me decades ago, said, "Good night, Ellie, don't let the bed get cold," his old tired joke. His smile was faint, a ghost of the young man's grin that had once quickened my pulse. I smiled back, the same practiced gentle curve of the lips. In the morning he was simply gone. The space beside me was cool. His reading glasses were folded neatly on his biography. His face held a look of profound peace, a relief so deep it seemed to have smoothed every line of worry, every trace of the quiet burden he'd carried, the burden of me, of my silent, screaming need that he could not answer. The children descended. David, efficient and red-eyed, handled the calls to the lawyer, the funeral home. Caroline, vibrating with a grief that sought outlet in organization, planned the service. It was, of course, impeccable, a tasteful gathering at St. James's. The right hymns, the right flowers, white lilies, Arthur found roses. Sentimental, the right people speaking with the right amount of subdued praise. A pillar of the community, a devoted family man, a steady hand. I sat in the front pew, a black veil over my face, not out of old-fashioned mourning, but because it was the only thing I could think to do with my face. What expression was appropriate? Grief? Yes, of course, but what kind? The real, the complicated truth was a nest of vipers in my chest. Sorrow, yes, a deep, aching sorrow for the man he had been, for the life we had planned, for the shared history that was now mine alone to carry. But beneath it, rushing in like cold air into a vacuum, was a terrifying, shameful, exhilarating sense of release. The great unspoken was over. The treaty was dissolved by a higher power. The silent, aching stalemate of our bed was concluded. I was free of the daily, gentle torture of his proximity, of the constant, mute reminder of what was not happening. The guilt I felt for this relief was immediate and crushing. I wept in the shower, the sound, masked by the water, weeping for Arthur, for myself, for the sheer, messy inhumanity of feeling unshackled by your husband's death. After the last casserole dish was returned, after David and Caroline flew back to their own lives, their concern shifting from mother is grieving to mother is managing, the new silence began. It was different. Before, the silence had been a presence, a third entity in the room with us, heavy with everything unsaid. Now the silence was just space, my space. I wandered the museum, and for the first time I saw it not as our shared collection, but as mine. I could move a vase if I wished. I could play Stravinsky at AM, loud and discordant. I could eat crackers in bed. These tiny, stupid freedoms felt revolutionary. I tested them like a prisoner testing the boundaries of a suddenly open cell. I left a book sprawled open on the drawing-room sofa for 2 days. No one sighed and closed it. I made a pot of tea and only drank 1 cup. The rest went cold in the pot. It was waste, glorious waste, but the space quickly yawned. The children called every Sunday, a dutiful check-in. Their conversations were life rafts thrown from a great distance. "You sound good, Mother. Are you keeping busy?" Busy, the great anesthetic. I was busy being alone. Sophia came, Maria came, but they were satellites orbiting my solitary planet. Our conversations were functional, pleasant, empty. They called me Mrs. Pembroke. I began to forget the sound of my first name. Loneliness, I discovered, had flavors, the loneliness of a dysfunctional. Marriage was a bitter, acrid thing, a constant friction. This new loneliness was a vast, hollow sweetness. It was all mine. There was no one to disappoint, no one to silently long for, no one to perform for, but a hollow, no matter how vast, is still an emptiness. I would catch myself speaking to Arthur, not in a ghostly, spiritual way, but in practicalities. Arthur, the Robertson account statement came, or the magnolia is blooming early, and I would stop, the words hanging in the silent air, and feel foolish. Then I would feel a pang, not of longing for him, but of longing for the habit of him. For the shape of another consciousness in the house, even a silent, retreating one. The museum was under my sole curatorship now, but what was the point of a museum with no visitors? What was the purpose of preserving a life that was over? I was tending the artifacts of a civilization that had fallen. I was the last living native of a country that no longer existed, speaking a language only I remembered. The freedom was absolute, and it was the most lonely thing I had ever known. It was a blank canvas, and I, at nearly 80, had forgotten how to hold a brush. The ping in the silence and narration by Eleanor the computer was Arthur's domain. A sleek black machine in the library used for reviewing quarterly reports and the occasional game of digital chess. After he died, it sat like a monolith, a dormant piece of technology I had no use for. My world was analog, books, newspapers, the physical mail that piled on the hall table. Caroline, during one of her visits, had fussed over it. Mother, you need to be connected. For safety, for family. She'd created an email account for me, Eleanor Pembroke, with a password she wrote on a pastel sticky note. She'd also, with a few brisk clicks, installed something called Facebook. David and I will post pictures of the grandchildren. You can just look. It's a window, a window. I'd nodded, compliant. It became another part of the weekly ritual. On Sunday evenings after their calls, I would sometimes power the machine to life, its hum alien in the quiet room. I'd log in, the screen glowing like a cold hearth. I'd see Caroline's children at a soccer game, David at a corporate retreat. The images were bright, flat, and strangely soulless, happy moments curated for public consumption. I'd feel a pang, distant and familiar, and then close the window. It felt like reading a newsletter about a foreign country where I once held citizenship but had let my passport expire. Then came the ping. It was a Thursday afternoon, raining in that soft, persistent way that made the house feel like a ship adrift. I'd made my tea, taken it to the library. On a whim, or perhaps just to have a light to look at other than the gray one outside, I'd opened the computer. I navigated to the Facebook page, the blue and white interface sterile and unwelcoming. At the top of the screen, a red circle with a 1 in it. Not over the familiar family photos, but over a silhouette icon. Friend. Requests. My heart did a silly, anachronistic little flip. A request. Who on earth? Some long-lost schoolmate, now also widowed and desperate for digital connection. A distant cousin looking for genealogy details. I clicked. The name, Robert Thorne. The profile picture stopped me. It wasn't the stiff, smiling headshot of a man in a suit. It was a photograph of a man on a metal gantry, the sky behind him a bruised purple and orange. He wore a heavy work jacket, a hard hat tucked under his arm. His face was turned partly away, looking out at a vast, turbulent sea, but I could see a strong jaw, lines etched by weather, not worry, and hair the color of steel wool swept back from his forehead. He looked capable. He looked like he wrestled with real things, wind, metal, salt, not stock portfolios and committee minutes. I clicked on his profile. It was sparse, private. His about said, rig engineer, currently on the Nordic Pioneer. Home is where the sea isn't, but I miss it when I'm there. There were a few other photos. A rugged coastline, a dog that looked like a mix of everything, a close-up of a breathtakingly complex piece of machinery. And then I saw it, a public post from a group I'd one-sidedly joined, the Sibelius Society. It was a link to a rare recording of the violin concerto. Under it, someone had commented, "The adagio feels like watching light break through ice." The commenter was Robert Thorne. It was my comment from 6 months ago. He had seen that. He had remembered it or searched for it. His message accompanied the request. I opened it, my fingers cold on the keys. "Dear Eleanor," it began. Not Mrs. Pembroke, Eleanor, a name I hadn't been called by a man in decades. Forgive the intrusion from a complete stranger. I was scrolling through that group tonight. It is a tenuous link to civilization out here, and I saw your comment on the Sibelius, light breaking through ice. It stopped me. I've listened to that piece 100 times on night watch, staring at black water, and I never had the words for what it made me feel. You gave them to me. I've been on this rig for 94 days. The conversation is mostly about torque and hydraulic fluid. I hope it is not too forward to say that the thought of a conversation about something beautiful with someone who sees light and ice feels like a lifeline thrown. Whether you accept this or not, thank you for that phrase. Sincerely, Robert Thorne. I read it. Then I read it again. The rain tapped against the window panes. It was specific. It was thoughtful. It acknowledged the strangeness, the distance. It spoke of beauty and loneliness in the same breath. It did not feel like a broadcast. It felt like a letter slipped under a door. For 24 hours, I did nothing. I moved. Through my routines, the tea, the mail, the evening news, but his words echoed in the silent spaces of my mind. A lifeline thrown. I knew about lifelines. I was adrift in a sea of rooms and memories. What was the correct protocol here? What would people say? But then a new, startling thought arose. Who is there to say anything? Arthur was gone. The children were distant. The social world that once policed my every move had receded to Christmas cards and funeral notices. I was the curator, and I could, if I wished, add a new, unexpected piece to the collection, a digital phantom. The next evening, as the same soft dusk settled, I went back to the library. The red circle still glowed. I moved the cursor over the button. It said confirm. I took a breath, a deep one that filled lungs that suddenly felt younger. It was just a click. It was just a window. It wasn't real. I clicked. The sound the computer made was a soft digital chime, the ping in the silence. It was the smallest of sounds, but in the museum of my life it echoed like a gong. The digital lifeline narration by Eleanor for 3 days, nothing. The confirmation hung in the digital ether, and my brief, foolish surge of courage began to curdle into embarrassment. Of course, it had been a moment of whimsy, a gesture from a man perhaps already back on shore and surrounded by real, tangible life. I had misread. A polite thank you note as an invitation. It was the desperate imagination of a lonely old woman. I avoided the library computer. Its sleek surface now seemed to mock me. I took long, punishing walks, trying to outpace my own humiliation. On the 4th day, as I was listlessly arranging hydrangeas in a vase, the landline in the kitchen rang a jarring, archaic sound. It was Caroline, her voice crisp with concern. "Mother," I saw. "You accepted a friend request from someone named Robert Thorne." "Who is that?" "Do you know him?" The digital tether to my daughter, my window, also functioned as a subtle surveillance system. I felt a flush of heat, defensive and guilty. A member of the Sibelius Society online group, dear, I said, my voice impressively steady. He appreciated a comment I'd made. It's perfectly harmless. I could hear her silent calculation. On the other end of the line, assessing risk, weighing the oddity against my documented loneliness. Just be careful, Mother. The internet is full of strange people. I am 80 years old, Caroline, I said, a touch of asperity in my tone. I believe I can manage an online acquaintance. We hung up, the unspoken words hovering. Because you are 80 and lonely, you are the most vulnerable of all. Her call, however, had the opposite effect. It made Robert Thorne real. He was a subject of discussion, a potential threat in my daughter's eyes. And that night, driven by a mix of defiance and rekindled curiosity, I returned to the library. The blue notification light was blinking, a private message. Eleanor, it began, again with the devastating simplicity of my first name. I owe you an apology. A storm system knocked out our satellite link for 72 hours. We were in a blackout bubble, just the wind screaming and the rig groaning. I spent a good part of it thinking about your phrase, light breaking through ice, and how I probably scared you off with my earnestness. If you're still there, tell me, what is the piece of music that feels most like home to you? He was there, and he'd been thinking of me, not of my comment, but of me. My reply was hesitant at first, typed with one careful finger. I told him it was the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, not the big romantic first movement everyone loves. I wrote, the Adagio. It's not a home of warmth, but of profound, spacious melancholy, a beautiful empty room. His response came the next morning. He'd listened to it on shift, with the dawn coming up over the water. You're right, he wrote, it's not a cozy home. It's a cathedral, and the loneliness in it isn't desperate. It's majestic. You have to be strong to live in a piece like that. It demands a certain stature of spirit. No one had ever spoken to me like this. Arthur had praised my hostessing, my taste. My children praised my resilience. This stranger was speaking to my soul, and he found it majestic. So began the digital lifeline. It became our ritual. My days, once structured by obligation, now orbited the moment I would allow myself to go to the library, to see the blue light, to dive into the world of words on the screen. We talked of music, of course, but also of the books that had shaped us. He favored Steinbeck and maritime history. I offered Austen and the Russians. We talked of the sea, which he described not with postcard beauty, but with terrifying, inspiring reality. The way a 70-foot wave looked from the deck, not like water, but like a moving cliff. The eerie bioluminescence in the wake at midnight. The sound of ice calving in the northern fields, a roar that felt like the planet itself cracking. And we talked cautiously at first, then with growing trust, of loneliness. Out here, he wrote one night, the loneliness is geographic, absolute. You are a speck on an infinite wet desert, but there's a purity to it. Your aloneness is a fact, like the wind. Back on land, in my little house in Portland, the loneliness is different. It's the silence after the engine noise stops. It's the echo in rooms that have only ever held one. That's a heavier kind. I stared at the screen, my breath caught. He had given me the vocabulary for my own condition. My loneliness wasn't the majestic cathedral kind of the Rachmaninoff. It was the landlocked kind, the echo, emboldened. I typed my truth into the glowing rectangle. I feel the cold more inside than out. I live in a house full of objects that all whisper of the past. I have everything you could practically need, and I feel unseen, as if I've become a portrait on my own wall. The typing indicator flickered for a long minute. Then his reply appeared. I see you, Eleanor. I see the woman in the music you love, in the way you describe light and ice and empty rooms. There is a fire there, banked maybe, but not out. It's not too late to feel its warmth. Tears, hot and shocking, blurred the words on the screen. They were not tears of sadness, but of recognition. He had seen past the curated exterior, past the widow, the mother, the donor. He had seen the buried Denver and called it fire. He had thrown a lifeline and I had caught it. And for the first time in 30 years, I felt a terrifying, glorious thing. I felt pulled. The promise and narration by Eleanor, his words, began to change the composition of the air. The museum no longer felt like a sealed tomb, but an antechamber, a waiting room. Each morning I awoke with a new, fizzy sense of potential humming just beneath my skin, a sensation so forgotten it felt pathological. I caught myself smiling at nothing, at the way the light caught the dust motes, at the absurd perfection of a single red leaf on the green lawn. The world was coming back into focus, not as a series of obligations, but as a set of possibilities. Our conversations deepened, shifted. We moved from discussing art to discussing touch, not in a crude way, but as a concept. He spoke of the physical reality of his world, the heft of a wrench, the bite of a salt spray wind, the solid, vibrating deck under his boots. I confessed in halting sentences, the memory of touch as a language. I'd forgotten how to speak. Arthur was a good man. I typed one evening, the screen a confessional, but his touch became informational, a hand on the arm to guide me through a door, a peck on the cheek for the photographer. It was punctuation, not poetry. Robert's response was immediate. Punctuation. God, that's heartbreaking. Touch should be a novel, Eleanor. A whole damned epic poem written on the skin. It should be about discovery, not direction. An epic poem. I read the phrase over and over, my own skin prickling with a ghostly anticipation. He began to paint a future with his words. It was not vague. It was meticulously, sensually detailed. He was due to finish his rotation in 6 weeks. He had leave saved. My first night back, he wrote, I'm going to drive down the coast. I'll find a cove where the wind sculpts the cypress trees into wild shapes. I'll take you there. I'll hold your hand, and your hand won't be a fragile thing to be supported. It will be a strong, beautiful thing to be interlaced with mine. We'll stand against that wind, and it will whip your hair and my jacket, and it will be so loud we won't be able to hear each other speak, and we won't need to. I could feel it, the sting of the salt air, the pull of the gale, the solid, warm anchor of his hand. He promised me more. He promised the quiet after the wind, a fire in a hearth of a rented cottage, the weight of a wool blanket shared across our laps. I will listen to every story your body wants to tell, he wrote, the words glowing on the screen. Every year you've lived, every line, every softness, every strength, I will read. Them like a man who's been in the dark for too long, finally given a book in a language he understands. It was an absolution, a sacred promise. He wasn't promising to ignore my age, but to worship the journey it represented. He called me his late-blooming rose and said the blooms that come late after a long frost are often the most fragrant, the most deeply colored. The promises became a daily liturgy. I will make you breakfast and watch the light change on your face. I will dance with you in the middle of a silent living room to a song only we can hear. I will make you feel every one of your years not as a subtraction, but as a testament to survival, to elegance, to a fire that wouldn't go out. Each vow was a key turning in a lock I'd believed rusted shut. The hunger I had curated, disciplined, sublimated for decades was now being not just acknowledged, but celebrated, summoned. He was speaking to the woman in the portrait, and she was stepping out of the frame. I began to make small, secret preparations. I went to a boutique and bought a bottle of perfume not like the powdery florals I usually wore, but something with notes of amber and sea salt. I applied it at night just to smell it on my own wrists. I dug out a silk camisole from the back of a drawer, a relic from another lifetime, and held it against me. I played Sibelius's violin concerto, and the adagio was no longer about light breaking through ice, but about warmth flooding into long frozen veins. One night his message was a culmination, a crescendo. I have lived a life of machinery and men, of hard edges and cold metals. You are the soft landing I never let myself dream of. Tell me everything you've ever wanted, Eleanor. Every quiet, forbidden wish. Let me be the answer to it. With trembling fingers, I poured my heart onto the screen. I told him of the longing for a gaze that felt like being seen in full sunlight, of the desire to be held not like something precious and breakable, but like something essential and desired, of the wish to feel just once more the thrilling, terrifying swoop of attraction, and to have it met, matched, and returned. His reply sealed my fate. Consider it done, my love. I will do everything you've dreamed of. I'll do it double. Double. The word echoed in the silent library. It was an extravagance, an overabundance. After a famine of decades, he was offering a feast. I believed him. With every neglected, yearning cell in my body, I believed him. The promise was the most real thing in my world. It was the north on my compass, the date circled on a calendar. That had been blank for years. I was no longer waiting for an end. I was waiting for a beginning, the first wire and aeration by Eleanor. The euphoria of the promise lasted 5 days. It was a honeymoon in the digital ether, a period where the scent of sea salt perfume on my wrists and the vivid technicolor daydreams of a windswept cove were enough to sustain me. My emails to him became longer, more effusive, tinged with a girlish giddiness that should have embarrassed me, but didn't. I was Eleanor in love, a creature I thought extinct. Then the tone of his messages shifted. The lyricism remained, but beneath it ran a new, urgent current. He wrote of delays, of corporate incompetence, of a grinding bureaucracy that governed his world. The machine that hauls up the coarse amples is acting like a petulant child, he wrote one evening. A vital sensor array has failed. The company men in their Houston offices are dragging their feet on authorization for a replacement. Every day this is stalled is another day I'm held here. Another day our cove is just a picture in my mind and not a place where we are standing. I felt a sympathetic pang. The frustration was palpable. Is there nothing you can do? I typed back, already wishing I could solve it to sweep the obstacles from his path. The typing indicator blinked for a long moment. There is one thing, his reply came. I could source the part myself from a supplier in Singapore, pay for the expedited shipping, install it myself on my next shift. It would cost a significant amount, more than I have liquid right now. The company would reimburse me, of course, the moment I'm back on land and can file the paperwork. But it would get me to you weeks, maybe a month sooner. The numbers appeared on the screen, $25,000. A silence fell in the library, deeper than the usual quiet. The number hung there, black on white, digital and cold. It was not a fortune, not to me. The interest on one of my money market accounts could cover it twice over. But it was a key turning in a different kind of lock. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp, Caroline's voice. On the phone, be careful, Mother. The internet is full of strange people. This was strange. This was a man I had never met asking for money. The old Eleanor, the curator, the committee woman, would have shut this down with a polite, frosty finality. She would have seen the breach of protocol from a mile away. But I was not that woman anymore. I was the woman who had been promised an epic poem written on her skin, the woman who had been seen. The $25,000 wasn't just money. It was a toll on the bridge he was building between his world and mine, a practical step towards the poetic. My fingers hovered over the keys. The warning bell chimed again, faint and far away. I silenced it with the memory of his voice from our one precious phone call, a deep, resonant baritone that had flowed through me like warm brandy, with the image of his weathered, kind face in the profile picture, with the specific, uncalculated beauty of his phrases about my spirit. This was not a scam. Scams were crude, greedy, impatient. This was a man in a bind, a practical man trying to solve a practical problem to reach a profoundly impractical dream, our dream. He must have sensed my hesitation because a new message arrived. Forget I mentioned it, my love. It was unfair of me. I'll wait out the company red tape. I've waited this long for you. A few more weeks is nothing. The thought of you is enough. It was unfair of me that did it. His chivalry, his willingness to endure the delay, made my suspicion feel cheap, a stain on our connection. He was proving his goodness by withdrawing the request. I couldn't let his goodness be a punishment for us both. No, I typed, my decision crystallizing. Don't wait. Tell me what to do. He protested once more, beautifully. I insisted, with a show of grateful reluctance. He sent wiring instructions, a bank in Singapore, an account number, a beneficiary name that matched his. The corporate supplier, he explained. The next morning I drove to my bank. Mr. Henderson, my banker, raised a polite eyebrow at the international transfer form. A rather large personal transaction, Mrs. Pembroke, everything above board. An investment, I said, my voice serene, in a timely project. It wasn't a lie. I signed the forms. The money, a number in a ledger, ceased to be mine. As I drove home, a peculiar lightness replaced the brief anxiety. I had acted. I had moved the narrative forward. I was no longer just a recipient of promises. I was a participant in their fulfillment. I emailed him the confirmation code. His response was a torrent of emotion, gratitude, love, visions of our reunion now painted with even brighter colors. Every dollar is a step closer to you, he wrote. The warning bell, that faint tinny chime, was swallowed whole by the symphony of his gratitude. I had paid the toll. The bridge, I believed with all my heart, was now under active construction. I had just financed the first girder. The rhythm of crisis and narration by Eleanor after the first wire. There was a brief golden period. His messages were aflame with gratitude and anticipation. He sent me a blurry photo of a massive, greasy component on a shipping pallet. The heart of the beast, he called it. You gave it a heartbeat. I printed the photo on the color printer, a ridiculous act, and tucked it into my music book. It was my first tangible piece of him. The rhythm of our daily talks resumed, sweeter than ever. For a week it was perfect. Then the rhythm changed. It began with a customs issue, a sudden punitive levy imposed on the part due to shifting trade protocols. He needed $18,000 to clear it, or it would be held in a Singaporean warehouse for weeks. I'm so sorry to even whisper this. His message read, "The bureaucracy out here is a living monster. I feel like I'm bleeding money just to keep our dream alive." A cold trickle of doubt, but I drowned it with reason. International business was complex. I'd heard Arthur complain of similar things. This was the reality of his world. A world of hard edges and sudden costs. I sent the money before I could even receive his full-throated thanks. The next crisis hit. A crewmate, a man named Finn, had a severe reaction to a welding chemical. This time my breath caught. That's a medical evacuation. I typed, my fingers clumsy. It's a life, Eleanor, came the instant reply. He has 3 kids. I can't look at them if I let their father languish. I'll pay you back every cent. I swear on everything I hope to have with you. This is just who I am. I help my men. Who I am. He framed it as a moral test, and in doing so, framed my support as a measure of my character. To question was to be small, to be the kind of woman who valued money over a life. I saw him then, not just as my lover, but as a leader, a courageous and loyal man. My doubt transformed into a fierce, protective pride. Of course, he would do this, and I, by extension, would do it for him. I wired the funds. The emergencies began to arrive with a terrible, predictable cadence, a dreadful sonata. Each request was a master class in persuasive storytelling. They were filled with technical details that sounded authentic. I Googled some. They checked out, laden with profuse apologies, and always, always anchored back to us. This is the last hurdle, my love. Once this is cleared, the path is open. I am fighting my way through a jungle of red tape to get to you. My world telescoped. The museum around me faded into a blur. My daily focus became my bank statements, the dwindling numbers in my money market and brokerage accounts. I was liquidating Arthur's careful investments to fund Robert's emergencies. The logic was circular and airtight. To protect our future, I had to invest in his present. The promised reimbursements from his company were always just one more cleared invoice away. I stopped mentioning the transactions to anyone, not that there was anyone to tell. A deep, instinctive shame began to coat my actions, even as I justified them. This was not the elegant, romantic partnership I'd envisioned. This was triage, but I was all in. The more I sent, the more invested I became, not just emotionally, but financially. To doubt him now would be to admit I had been catastrophically foolish, not once, but over and over again. My pride, my desperate love, and my sunk costs formed an unbreakable chain. He began to call me his angel, his savior. The language was intoxicating. After a lifetime of being a decorative object, a competent manager, I was now essential. I was the reason a good man could save his friend, do his job, and come home to love. It was a headier drug than any promise of touch. The rhythm of crisis became the rhythm of my life. A new email would arrive, my stomach would clench, I would read the latest disaster, feel the panic, then steady myself with the vision of the cove, the cottage, his hands. I'd make the transfer, a temporary euphoria of relief and purpose would follow. Then the silent waiting for the next beat to fall. I was dancing to a terrible, expensive music only I could hear pouring the curated wealth of a lifetime into a digital black hole. Each wire a prayer that this finally would be the one that bought my way back to feeling. The hunger for touch had been cleverly, precisely fused with a desperate need to be his solution. I was no longer just funding a man. I was funding my own redemption, the hollowing museum and narration by Eleanor. I stood in the center of the formal drawing room, the one with the Chippendale sofa and the faded patch on the rug. The 4 o'clock light, that merciless examiner, was at it again. But now it showed me something new. It showed the absence. The light fell across the space on the mantel where the pair of Ming Dynasty Meeping vases had stood for 40 years. I'd sold them last month through a discreet dealer in New York. A change in taste. I'd told him over the phone, my voice as smooth as porcelain. The light glinted off the glass front of the bookcase, highlighting the empty slot where the first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird had lived. Arthur had given it to me on our 30th anniversary. Gone. $12,000. It covered a crew bonus to prevent a strike that would delay demobilization. I walked slowly, a spectral inventory taker, the small Turner watercolor of a Venetian canal gone from the morning room wall, the set of Georgian silver candlesticks from the dining table, their shapes still faintly indented in the velvet of the case. Each empty space was a tooth knocked out of a familiar smile. The museum was being deaccessioned piece by precious piece. I was selling off the collection to fund the ongoing excavation of my own fantasy. The artifacts of a real, accumulated life were being converted into digital currency and zapped across the world to appease the gods of misfortune that seemed to exclusively haunt Robert Thorne. The house itself began to feel different. It wasn't just silent. It was hollow. The valuable objects had not just been decorations. They had been density. They had given the rooms weight, history, a sense of permanence. Now the rooms felt like stage sets, beautiful but flat behind the exquisite wallpaper. I could sense the void. I'd told Robert about the sales, of course. I'd framed them as sacrifices I was willing to make. My darling, no, he'd written back, a masterpiece of anguished nobility. Those are your treasures. I feel sick that my troubles are costing you your history. Let me handle this. I'll find another way. His protest was the exact spark needed to ignite my defiant generosity. Our history is ahead of us, I'd typed back, tears of righteous love in my eyes. These are just things. You are my future. And so the hollowing continued. The transactions were no longer just numbers on a screen. They were physical voids in my environment. I'd pass a blank space on the wall and feel a pang, not of loss for the object, but of dizzying disorientation. Who was I without these things? They had been the proofs of my life, of my marriage, my taste, my social position. Now I was a woman in an emptying house, her identity leaching away with every wire transfer. Yet the promise was the pole star. It glowed brighter as my real world grew dimmer. The more I gave up, the more invested I became in the fantasy. It had to be real. It simply had to be. Because if it wasn't, then I wasn't a brave woman burning her past for a radiant future. I was a fool being stripped bare. The final personal treasure to go was my jewelry. Not the everyday pieces, but the legacy items. My mother's Art Deco emerald necklace, the diamond earrings Arthur had given me when David was born. I sold them to a private jeweler who came to the house, his face a mask of professional pity. He knew this was not a woman upgrading. Her style. This was a liquidation. The $200,000 they brought was gone in a week. A catastrophic drive failure on the Rigus main computer that stored all his contract data. A replacement and data recovery service exorbitantly priced due to the remote location. After that transfer, I walked through the hollowed museum. The walls seemed to whisper back at me, their echoes unimpeded by tapestry or canvas. I felt light, almost weightless. I had shed so much. I was approaching some essential, stripped down version of myself. Soon, I thought, there would be nothing left of the old Eleanor to impede the new one. I would be a clean, empty vessel, ready to be filled with the sea wind, with his voice, with his touch. The house was a shell. I was becoming one too. But in the emptiness, I convinced myself there was now room for everything he had promised. The hollowness wasn't decay. It was preparation. I was making space for the epic poem. The final anchor narration by Eleanor the Money from the Jewels was the last of it. The final liquid drip from the well. I sat at the library desk, the financial statements spread before me like a patient's grim chart. The robust balances Arthur had nurtured, the dividends that had flowed in with the quiet reliability of the seasons, were skeletal. A few $1,000s remained in checking, a polite fiction of solvency. A profound quiet followed, different from the hollow silence of the house. This was the silence after the engine fails. The money had been a fuel, the thing that powered the frantic activity, the transfers, the sense of fighting for something. Now it was gone. For 2 days, Robert's messages were tender, concerned. He asked after me, sent beautiful descriptions of the northern lights he'd seen, told me he was working miracles to wrap things up. I clung to these messages, my only nourishment. Then, on the 3rd day, the tone shifted. The subject line was a single word, critical. "My love, I am in a vice," it began, the language tighter, fiercer than before. "The client is invoking a penalty clause for every day the rig is held past the contract end date. They claim the initial machine failure constitutes a breach. The fines are astronomical. If I don't pay a settlement up front to release the rig and my crew, they'll seize my professional license. I'll be finished, blacklisted. I won't be able to work, to provide, to come to you. It's a hostage situation." The number he named was $400,000. A sound escaped me, a dry, papery gasp. The number wasn't just large. It was impossible. It was a solid wall where there had been a path. "I have nothing left, Robert," I typed, the words the barest whisper of truth on the screen. "The accounts are empty. I've sold everything I can." His reply was immediate, as if he'd been waiting for this. "The house, Eleanor, Willow Creek Lane. There must be millions. Inequity. A short-term loan, a line of credit against it. Just to secure our future. It's the only asset left, the final asset. Once I'm free and the company reimburses me, we'll pay it off in a day. We'll sell the monstrosity and be done with it. We'll buy our cottage with what's left. This is the last hurdle, my darling. The absolute last one. I can see the shore, the final asset. The house, Willow Creek Lane. It wasn't just property. It was my shell, my museum, my last tangible proof of a life lived. It was the final anchor holding the ghost ship of Eleanor Pembroke to any recognizable shore, to mortgage it. It felt less like a financial decision and more like a metaphysical one. It was signing over the deed to my past, my last scrap of security, to underwrite a future that existed only in pixels and promises. I didn't leave the library for hours. I stared at the portrait of my younger self in the hall, visible from the desk. She looked back, confident, unafraid, securely framed. I thought of Arthur, his careful stewardship of this place. I thought of my children, who still, in some way, considered it home. Then I thought of the cove, the wind, the promise of hands that would read my history like a beloved text, the promise of being seen, not as a curator of a dying estate, but as a woman, alive and desired. Robert's plea wasn't just about money. It was a test of faith. After all I had given, would I balk at the final threshold? Would I choose a house, a cold, empty museum over him? Over us? The old Eleanor, the one in the portrait, would have chosen the house. It was the sane, the respectable, the safe choice. But the old Eleanor was gone. I had sold her off piece by piece. What remained was a raw, yearning nerve, a heart that had been promised a sunrise after an endless night. I opened a new email. I typed to my banker, Mr. Henderson, copying the language Robert had suggested. I wish to explore a residential line of credit secured against my primary residence at Willow Creek Lane for home improvement projects and financial planning. It was the first outright lie I had ever told Mr. Henderson. The words looked alien on the screen, but as I typed them, a strange calm descended. The decision was made. The anchor was being weighed. I was cutting the last tie. The paperwork was a blur of signatures. Mr. Henderson was solemn, thorough, asking repeatedly if I was sure, if I needed to consult with David. "This is a significant leveraging of your estate, Eleanor," he said, his use of my first name a flag of concern. "I'm sure," I said, my voice a smooth, placid lake. "It's time for a change." When the funds hit my account, a number so large it felt fictional, I felt a surge of power, of fatalistic momentum. This was it, the final grand gesture. I wired the money into transactions, the clicks of the mouse-like detonations. I stood up from the desk and walked through the hollow mortgaged rooms. They were no longer my museum. They were collateral. They were the traded token for my real life, which was finally, imminently about to begin. The anchor was up. I was adrift, but I was sailing at last toward him. After the final seismic transfer, a strange peace settled over me. It was the peace of the gambler who has pushed every last chip onto a single number. The wheel is spinning, the outcome is fate, and there is nothing left to do but watch. For 24 hours, there was only gratitude. His messages were torrential, lush with relief and vivid, specific plans. He sent a link to a property listing for a stone cottage in Mendocino, its windows facing the Pacific. Our first window, he wrote. He talked of flights, of renting a convertible for the drive up the coast, of the specific brand of coffee he would brew for me on our first morning. I printed the cottage listing and pinned it to the fridge, a slash of color on the stainless steel. It was no longer a fantasy. It was a destination. I began to pack a small suitcase in my mind, selecting not the tailored suits or pearl strands, but the soft cashmere wraps, the sturdy walking shoes, the sea salt perfume. Then the messages began to thin. The first day of silence was understandable. He'd be dealing with the logistics of his release, the demobilization of the rig. The second day, I sent a gentle inquiry, thinking of you. Hope the shore is in sight. The reply came hours later, uncharacteristically brief. Complications, paperwork hell. Soon. The word soon had lost its shape. It had been bent and stretched over months of emergencies. Now it felt brittle. A third day passed, no word. I sat in the library, the computer screen dark, the empty spaces on the walls seeming too leanen. The hollowness of the house was no longer a preparation. It was an amplification chamber for my own ticking anxiety. On the morning of the fourth day, a new email arrived. The subject line was blank. The body of the message contained no greeting, no endearment. There's been a final tax assessment and penalty from the Norwegian Maritime Authority, a miscalculation on the earlier fine. They are holding my passport. $80,000 will clear it. This is the absolute last thing. I am so close I can taste the salt air. Send it to the same account. Time is critical. I read it once. Then, again, the syntax was off. It was all statement, no music. No, my love, no angel, no poetic flourish. It was an invoice. A coldness, sharp and clean as an icicle, speared through the warm, cloying fog of my devotion. For the first time, I saw the words not as a cry for help from my lover, but as a transmission from a machine that had been expertly calibrated to my frequency. My hands were steady as I placed them on the keyboard. The trembling was deep inside in the marrow. I typed my reply, each keystroke a hammer tap on the ice. Robert, I have nothing left. The house is mortgaged. I have nothing. I hit send. I did not look away from the screen. The response was instantaneous, as if he or something had been waiting, poised for this exact message. There was no pause for shock, for grief, for shared despair. The reply was a bullet. There's always equity. A second loan. Ask your children. Don't you want us to be together? I stared at the two sentences. Don't you want us to be together? It was a lever designed to pry open the last sealed chamber of my desperation. But the phrasing, it was crude. It was the clang of a trap snapping shut, not the sigh of a lover buckling under strain. The "don't you" was wrong. The Robert who had written me epic poems would have said, "Do you not see, my heart, how close we are?" This was someone else. The silence that followed this realization was not empty. It was a vacuum, and into it rushed a terrible, clarifying roar. The roar of every warning I had silenced, every doubt I had dressed up as faith, every dollar I had sent flying into the void. It was the sound of the museum's final glass case shattering, not from within, but from the pressure of the truth now collapsing inward. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply sat in the perfect, unbearable silence of my hollow, mortgaged home, the ghost of a man named Robert Thorne evaporating from the room, leaving behind only the scent of sea salt perfume and the chilling digital afterglow of a single ruthless question on a screen. I have nothing left. A narration by Eleanor. The silence in the wake of that message was a physical weight. It pressed the air from my lungs, pinned me to the leather chair in the library. The glow from the monitor was the only light in the gathering dusk, painting my hands a sickly blue. "Don't you want us to be together?" It echoed, not as a plea, but as a taunt, the final, naked manipulation. There was no artistry left, no velvet curtain over the machinery, just the cold, grinding gears of extraction. For a long time I didn't move. The part of me that had been Eleanor in love, the woman who had printed blurry photos and dreamed of coastal cottages, was dying a rapid, silent death. It was a shocking death, not with a bang, but with the quiet finality of a door clicking shut on an empty room. What rose in its place was not yet clarity, but a sharp survivalist instinct. The same instinct that had guided me through charity galas and boardroom negotiations, the ability to assess a devastating situation with clinical detachment. I was on a sinking ship. The lifeboat I had built from promises was made of paper. I needed to know the depth of the water. I stood up. My legs held. I walked to the hall, took my coat from its hook, my purse from the console table. My movements were automatic, precise. I did not look at the portrait. I could not bear her gaze. The drive to the bank was a blur of familiar streets seen through a new, harsh lens. Every manicured lawn, every grand doorway, seemed part of the elaborate set I had just bankrupted myself to escape. The irony was a bitter taste on my tongue. Mr. Henderson's office was, as it always was, oak-paneled, hushed, smelling of lemon polish and old money. He rose as I entered, his face a mask of professional courtesy that quickly fissured with concern. "Eleanor, this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" "You look—" "I need to understand my financial position," I said, my voice stranger than I'd ever heard it. It was flat, stripped of its usual cadence. "Exactly. And I need to know about these." I placed a single sheet of paper on his desk where I'd hastily printed the last few email exchanges, the request for the $80,000, my reply. His chilling response. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. He put on his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the page. I watched his face. I saw the moment his professional calm ruptured. A flush crept up his neck. His jaw tightened. He looked from the paper to me, his eyes wide behind the lenses. "Eleanor," he said, the word hushed with horror, "who is this man?" "He is the man I am to marry," I said, and even to my own ears it sounded like a line from a bad play. "He's been stranded on a contract. I have been helping him." The pity in his eyes was so profound it felt like a physical blow. It was the look one gives a terminal patient who doesn't yet know. "Eleanor, please, let me make some calls. Let me look into this. Just, please, sit down." This time I obeyed. My knees gave way. I sank into the client chair, my spine not touching the back. He left the room, the printed page in his hand. I stared at a painting on his wall, a ship in a storm, tossed on violent waves. I had seen it 100 times. Today I saw the doomed faces of the sailors, the splintering mast. He was gone for 20 minutes, a lifetime. When he returned, he was not alone. A younger woman from the fraud department was with him, her expression grave. Mr. Henderson did not sit behind his desk. He pulled a chair close to me, as if approaching a sickbed. Gently, using a laptop, he showed me reverse image searches. The profile picture matched to a Norwegian engineer's professional LinkedIn, the account. Now flagged the rig photos traced to a stock image site. The bank account in Singapore, a known mule account for a West African scam network. The phone number disconnected, linked to a bulk VoIP service. It's a very common romance scam, the younger woman said, her voice soft but clear. They target isolated individuals. They build a fantasy, a deep emotional connection to enable the theft. The emergencies are always escalating. They're very good at what they do. Mr. Henderson just looked at me, his eyes shining. Oh, Eleanor, my dear, dear Eleanor. The words did not land as a shock. They landed as a confirmation, the final piece of a puzzle whose dreadful picture I had already glimpsed. The numbness held. I did not weep. I simply deflated as if my very skeleton had been removed. I was a shell collapsing in on the howling void within. I had traded Willow Creek Lane, every treasured heirloom, every shred of financial security Arthur had built, for a phantom, for the echo of a promise of touch. I had poured the tangible proof of a long, respectable life into a digital sieve, the money. I heard myself say, the voice of a stranger. Mr. Henderson shook his head slowly, a world of sorrow in the gesture. Gone. Almost certainly untraceable. We can file reports with the FBI, the FTC, but recovery. In these cases, it's very rare. I nodded. It was the only movement I could manage. I was homeless, penniless, and utterly, devastatingly foolish. The curator had not just lost the collection. She had burned down the museum herself, believing she was escaping to a paradise. The ashes were all that remained, and they were mine to breathe. The unmaking a narration by Eleanor, they took me home, or rather, they took the empty vessel that had been Eleanor Pembroke back to the building on Willow Creek Lane. Mr. Henderson insisted on driving me himself, the young fraud officer following in her own car. I sat in the passenger seat of his sensible sedan, watching the landmarks of my life pass by: the club, the museum, the boutique where I'd bought the sea salt perfume as if through a thick, warped pane of glass. They were artifacts from a civilization that had just been vaporized. The two of them walked me to the door, a grotesque parody of gentlemanly escorts. Sophia, my cleaner, was just leaving. She took one look at my face, at the grim pity on the banker's face, and her own expression froze in a mask of Shakti or a Pembroke. Is everything? Everything is fine, Sophia, I said, the automatic lie emerging on its own. Thank you. I took my key and let myself in, closing the heavy door on their concerned faces. I leaned against it, listening to the soft crunch of their retreating footsteps on the gravel. Then I was alone in the hollow museum. The silence was different now. Before, it had been expectant, full of the promise of Robert's messages. Then it had been anxious, waiting for the next crisis. Now it was forensic. It was the silence of a crime scene after the investigators have left, when all that remains is the stark, unadorned evidence of the violation. I did not break down. I did not sink to the floor. A strange, hyper-alert calm held me. I began to walk. I walked from room to room, turning on every light. The recessed bulbs blazed, rendering the spaces shadowless, mercilessly clear. I was conducting an inventory of the unmaking. Here was the blank wall where the turner had hung. I had sold it for a customs levy that did not exist. There was the bare stretch of mahogany where the candlesticks had gleamed. They were gone for a crewmate who was a fiction, the empty niche for the meeping vases, the gap on the bookshelf. Each void was no longer just an absence. It was an accusation, a monument to my own breathtaking gullibility. I climbed the stairs. In my bedroom, I went to the dresser and opened the jewelry case. The velvet interiors were cavernous, holding only the ghost shapes of the emeralds and diamonds. I had traded my mother's legacy for a data recovery scam. Finally, I went to the library. The computer was dark. I did not turn it on. I looked at the desk where I had spent months weaving my own destruction, where I had felt so alive, so seen, so necessary. The chair seemed to hold the imprint of a fool. The magnitude of it began to descend, not as an emotional wave, but as a series of cold, factual weights settling upon my shoulders. I was homeless. The deed to this house was now owned in large part by the bank. The equity Robert had mentioned was a phantom just like him. I was penniless. The liquid assets were zero. The monthly dividends that had paid for Maria, for Sophia, for the taxes, for the very lights now blazing overhead gone. I was a woman in my 84th year, with nothing to her name but the clothes in her closet and the furniture that was now effectively owned by creditors. And I was a laughingstock, or I would be. Word would travel. Mr. Henderson was discreet, but such things seep out. The society that had been my warden would now feast on my tragedy. Poor Eleanor Pembroke, cleaned out by an online Romeo, senile, desperate. The narrative of my life, so carefully curated, would be rewritten in a single, savage sentence. The humiliation was absolute. It was a white-hot brand on my soul. I had not just been robbed. I had been unmade. The identity of Eleanor Pembroke, the wife, the philanthropist, the lady of the manor had been dismantled, its parts sold off to finance a fantasy. I stood in the center of the vast, lit, hollow house, and for the first time a sound escaped me. It was not a sob. It was a short, sharp, dry crack like a bone breaking. It was the sound of the last pretense snapping. There was no one to call. My children. The thought of telling David and Caroline brought a nausea so profound I had to steady myself on the back of the sofa. Their pity would be a second death. Their practical, horrified solutions would be a cage. I was alone, not in the lonely, bittersweet way I had been after Arthur died. This was a new, desolate aloneness. I was a castaway on an island of my own ruin, and I had burned the boat that brought me here. The unmaking was complete. All that was left was the woman standing in the blazing, silent evidence of her own extinction. Eleanor was gone. What remained was a raw, empty space where she used to be. The stubborn ember narration by Eleanor. They came, of course, David and Caroline. Mr. Henderson, bound by duty and a heart that had not fully calloused, had made the call I could not. Their arrival was a storm of muted horror, of clipped phone calls to lawyers, of hissed conversations in the foyer where they thought I couldn't hear. How could she? What was she thinking? We have to sell everything. I was a patient in my own home, which was no longer my home. They moved me out with a swift, clinical efficiency that mirrored my own hollow state. The museum was to be liquidated, the contents sold to pay down the catastrophic debt. Willow Creek Lane would go on the market. There was no discussion. My new room was in Laurel Grove, an assisted living facility with a name meant to evoke peaceful, wooded slopes. My room was a neutral box. Beige walls, a low-pile carpet, a single window overlooking a manicured courtyard with a plastic bird feeder. It was efficient, clean, and sterile. It smelled of lemony disinfectant and boiled vegetables. They had taken my furniture, my books, my paintings. Here I had a narrow bed, a small dresser, a single armchair upholstered in scratchy fabric. It was the final curation, Eleanor Pembroke, distilled to her most basic components. The humiliation was a constant companion, a cloak I wore invisibly. I saw it in the too careful eyes of the aides, in the way David's voice tightened when he discussed the situation, in Caroline's brisk, overwhelming practicality as she filled out endless forms for state aid, her pen stabbing the paper. I was their catastrophic late life burden. The scandal was contained, whispered about, but it was a stain on them too. I had broken the family narrative of prudent generational stewardship. For weeks, I moved through the routines of Laurel Grove like a sleepwalker, bingo in the common room, the bland, soft food in the dining hall, the gentle, condescending encouragement of the activities director. Join us for chair yoga, Eleanor. I was a ghost among the living, a cautionary tale wrapped in a cardigan. Then, one afternoon in early spring, I was sitting in my armchair by the window. A sparrow, a plain, brown, tenacious thing, was wrestling with a seed at the plastic feeder. It would peck, lose its grip, flutter back, and try again. There was no grace to it, only a stubborn, focused hunger. As I watched, a strange thing happened. I did not think of Robert, the phantom. His face, once so vivid, had blurred into a generic mask of deceit. I did not think of the lost vases, the sold jewelry, the mortgaged house. Those were just the props. I thought of the hunger, my hunger, the hunger that had lived in me since my 50s, that had paced the confines of my marriage like a beautiful caged animal. The hunger for a gaze that's all fire, not furniture, for a touch that was a language, not punctuation. The hunger that had been my secret shame, my silent rebellion, my private aching truth. That hunger had not been a scam. Robert had not created it. He had simply found it, a deep hidden well, and promised to be the water. He had weaponized my own deepest want against me. But the want itself, the want was real. It was the most real thing about me. The sparrow got its seed and flew off. A realization, quiet and devastating, unfurled inside the hollow space where Eleanor used to be. They had taken everything. The scammers had taken my money, my home, my security. My children had taken my independence, my history, my narrative. Society, if it knew, would take my dignity. But they had not taken the hunger, the capacity to long, to yearn, to want connection with a ferocity that defied reason and age that was mine. It had led me to ruin. It had made me a fool. But it was not a fool's desire. It was a human one. It was the last flickering proof that I was not just a collection of lost assets and poor choices. I was a living woman. The wanting meant I was still alive. Tears came then, not the hot tears of Robert's betrayal, but slow, cold tears of stark recognition. I was destitute. I was a punchline. I was old and alone in a beige room, but I was not empty. The hunger, that stubborn, stupid, glorious ember, still glowed. It had been exploited, abused, used to burn down my life, but it had not been extinguished. The scammers could steal the things I owned, but they could not steal the thing I was. A woman who, even at 84, even in the ashes, still longed to be seen, still longed to touch and be touched. Still longed, against all odds and reason, for an epic poem. It was a terrible, devastating truth. It offered no comfort, no solution, no path forward. It did not change my circumstances by a single material degree, but it was mine. I watched the empty bird feeder sway in the breeze. The sparrow did not return, but I knew it was out there, somewhere, looking for its next seed, driven by its own plain, tenacious hunger. And so was I. Thank you for sharing Eleanor's journey. Her story is a poignant and powerful reminder that loneliness and the longing for connection can make anyone vulnerable, regardless of age, wealth, or background. The most sophisticated scams don't target greed, they target the human heart. If Eleanor's story moved you or made you think, please share it. Talk about it with friends, with family, especially with older loved ones who might be isolated. Let's break the silence around these crimes and protect each other. Awareness is the first and strongest defense. Thank you for watching and for caring.